part of our ongoing program to promote board games from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Alrighty, let's look at the many factions of the Star Trek universe and how Star Trek Ascendancy uses its mechanical toolbox to make each faction feel unique and true to itself, while giving you a fun experience playing them. I'm heaping praise on this game because I love Star Trek, and I'm really impressed with the thematic integration here. Everything just feels right. We're going to look at all 10 factions in the game, starting off with a faction that's all about assimilation and making you part of their collective. That's right, the Federation. So what makes the Federation a terrifying opponent to play against? Why should the nice guys of Star Trek be a worry? Well, Strange New Worlds encourages you to explore rapidly in order to get the most you can from that ability. Other factions might hunker down and build, but the Federation will constantly be looking for new worlds to trigger the skill. This is a nice enough bonus, but it's the prime directive rule that dictates how the Federation is going to play. You cannot invade worlds at all, and you cannot just colonize primitive species. Invasion and troop attacks just won't be part of your game. So without invasions, hegemony is your main tool for expansion. But hegemony gives you fully developed systems without damaging them. And fortunately, you have fleets to back this up. The diplomatic fleet reduces the risk of a bad hegemony roll considerably. Your other two fleets help with colonizing empty worlds and science. Note that none of these are fleets that improve combat though. Your starting technology gives a boost to hegemony, and your other techs are an interesting mix of defensive and science technologies. The Starfleet Diplomatic Core is a key technology, and it reduces the cost of hegemony to 1 culture, meaning you can save more culture to buy Ascendancy tokens. So play the Federation if you want to explore the galaxy and research phenomenon, and then steal systems from your rivals using your cultural might instead of brute force. And if that sounds a bit soft to you, I recommend you try the Klingon Empire. With one of the most direct and straightforward playstyles, the Klingons bring a shoot first and ask questions never style to the game. First up, you cannot retreat. Not such a big deal when you are on the offensive, but smart players will use it against you to attack smaller forces. And Ever Victorious gives you culture for winning space battles. So even if you can't punch through and conquer your opponent's homeworlds, if you prolong a conflict long enough and force your opponents into an attritional war, you will keep gaining culture. Your special fleets also aid in this playstyle. One gains your resources for fighting, and the other specialize in space and planetary assaults. Your starting tech means you can never be in a position where your opponent's shields are too good for you to hit. And this means you can lag behind in weapon development a little and improve your own shields and other technologies first. And your other technologies are all about being more efficient in combat, planetary invasions, and ship productions. The Klingons really suit a player who is going to love throwing their fleets right at their opponents while declaring it is a good day to die. Playing them very conservatively is definitely not the best play. But be careful of going hard at a runaway leader and accidentally becoming a kingmaker for the other players. Next up, we have the final race from the core box, the tricky Romulan Star Empire. Where the Federation is all about culture and the Klingons about war, the Romulans are the science faction in the core box. Their first ability is an annoyance as it slows down the effectiveness of trade, meaning you won't get benefits from trade agreements for a while. People will still want to trade with you, but you have less incentive than any other player to agree. Cultural superiority is the defining feature of the Romulans. You get culture when you research certain technologies, and this helps funnel you into a research-focused path. As you can see, many of these techs have bonus culture on their side. Your starting advancement is awesome. When you attack, you get to roll dice and do hits before your opponents. This saves ships and makes battles that might otherwise be close one-sided. Your other technologies focus on improving your science output and making you better and more survivable in combat. The Romulans do have a dedicated battle fleet, as well as science and mining production fleets, which is nicely balanced and lets you choose how you will focus. The trick with the Romulans is to go hard at science, but not so hard that you're ignoring improving shields and weapons or building enough ships to defend your space. Your first strike ability, plus your reluctance to trade, means the occasional preemptive strike to unbalance your opponents is frequently a good play. Definitely a faction for a player who wants to be a bit standoffish and turtle a little, while also ruthlessly striking when they need to. Now we head into the standalone expansion box. First up, everyone's favourite space fascists, the villains of Deep Space Nine, the Cardassian Union. So, leaning into the fascist tropes pretty heavily, Cardassian worlds only generate resources if one of their ships is in orbit. This might seem like a slight inconvenience, but it dramatically changes your playstyle. In the early game, you just can't afford to throw ships out there and explore as often. You need them at home, keeping an eye on the worlds you've occupied. And speaking of occupation, well, you get a culture for every time you invade a planet. This all paints a pretty grim but interesting picture for how Cardassia plays. Their fleets lean into this with a battle fleet and a planetary assault fleet, but the fleet that stands out is the Overseer fleet, which can double production in a system. Find a good world with 3 nodes and park that fleet there. Their starter technology is very basic but strong, and extra command counter. And their other techs lean into the playstyle of taking existing systems through invasion, exploiting them for huge resources, and making it hard for rivals to take them back. Cardassia's playstyle can make them an absolute late game juggernaut, and if you slowly expand and build up your resource base early and not get raided a lot, you can be a powerhouse. They definitely suit a patient but ruthless player. Next up, the hit and miss comedy faction, who are supposedly a parody of hypercapitalism, but just sound exactly like actual capitalists. The Ferengi. Star Trek occasionally retunes their factions, and thank goodness they did with the Ferengi. That first episode with the chimp capering and whips is just awful. Let's be thankful for Deep Space Nine, and Armin Shimmerman in particular, who turned them into the love-to-hate Ferengi we now have. And their playstyle in Ascendancy is perfect. First of all, art, culture, who needs that? Ferengi cannot build culture nodes or add their Ascendancy level to hegemony attempts. What they can do, however, is build production nodes where culture nodes should go. And they can also spend 5 production to buy 1 culture. So while the Ferengi do not generate their own, they can just buy it. This combination of powers makes Ferengi singularly focused on massive production. Thankfully, they have tools to support that. Their starting technology lets them gain 1 production for each ship orbiting a rival. Now that sounds great, but what's to stop your opponents from just blasting your ships out of the sky? Ferengi trade agreements, that's what. These are by far the most lucrative trade agreements in the game and can easily generate 5 or 6 production by the mid-game. Now if the Ferengi player is doing that with 3 other players, they are going to be getting rich. But to go to war with them, you'll have to break that agreement. Ferengi fleets also allow them to get places others can't, and they can just trade in your systems without your permission. But the franchise fleet is the iconic one, dropping off friendly Ferengi in every system it flies past. The rest of their technologies promote a huge production engine, and while they have limited military improvements, they make up for that with sheer weight of numbers. Plus, the final 2 cards here combine for an incredibly strong hegemony engine, powered entirely by production. What can start off as a Ferengi weakness can become one of their big strengths. Ultimately, Ferengi suit a player who can start off being everyone's best friend and acting weak and helpless before planting a knife in their back and running away with the win. Next we head into the factions who featured most notably in Enterprise, and if you missed that shockingly awful show, their inclusion might seem odd, but nonetheless, we start off with the militant Andorian Empire. Andorians were introduced in the original show, but were pretty much ignored from Next Generation through Voyager, popping up again in Enterprise with a standout performance by Jeffrey Combs as Shran. Not the last time that guy will pop up here. Also, he played Brunt, the memorable Ferengi Liquidator. Anyway, the Andorians have an interesting toolkit that promotes a combination of science and combat focus. First, every time you win a battle, you get to keep a ship and use it as a research token. Secondly, if you have higher shields or weapons than other players, you get culture. So you see right away, the play here is to get bonus tokens so you can keep your tech edge and get free culture. Their fleets are unusual and they work exceedingly well once you have all 3 in play. The first one marks the system with a special token. The second one gains combat advantage when you have a token in that region, and the third one lets you move your fleets around. Mastering this fleet synergy and positioning will take you a long way to winning the game. Their starting technology is exceptional and makes retreating from you a nightmare while your own retreats become advantageous. This plays into a hit and run style. The rest of their tech cards mostly improve your combat effectiveness and research effectiveness, but Cerulean Warheads is a standout here. 3 ships blowing up at the start of a battle can be game changing. The Andorians suit a player who has excellent situational awareness of the game and can figure out how to use their tokens, mobility, and bonuses to create a military not even the Klingons can brush aside. The next faction is as classic Star Trek as you can get, the Vulcans. And hot damn, are they
fascinating.
Vulcans are weird, or should I just say
Fascinating.
First of all, you can't win the game with Ascendancy like the other players. Instead, you start on 3 Ascendancy and get 2 goals from this deck. One you make public, and the other you keep private. You win if you complete either of them. You also can't take over systems from players with lower Ascendancy than you. That's right, no invasions or hegemony until players catch up to your Ascendancy score. Vulcans also cannot colonize worlds normally. Their only option is to spend an Ascendancy to colonize unoccupied system. That being said, they can do that anywhere on the map. Throw in that they can't build star bases, and you have a really unusual looking faction here. Their other special rule lets them move other players' ships and attack with them with their permission, meaning the Vulcans can sit back and not risk their own resources, while helping an ally fight a war. Truly an odd power. But the most
fascinating
thing about this power is that the Vulcan player cannot lie. If you say you will not attack a player for 2 turns, you must abide by that decision. This level of honesty means you can broker deals and be a trusted neutral party in conflicts. Their fleets are quite unusual. They have a normal science fleet and 1 slow-moving fleet that reduces the risks of exploration. But the key fleet is the console one. That lets you drop off Vulcan ambassadors. These are special tokens that grant you, and the factions they are placed on, special bonuses. Your starting tech lets you build ships in these regions, which can be used to defend an ally's world from attack. Numerous other techs also give bonuses for having ambassadors present, so other players will welcome them. The Vulcans also have impressive trade deals, including one for culture that will be highly sought after. All this combines to a faction who wants to maintain peace and order and prevent other players from advancing too far and winning. They will support the underdogs against the aggressors, all while prolonging the game so they can score their own agenda. Definitely not a faction for first-time players. The Vulcan player needs to know who to prop up and who to work against to keep the game going long enough for them to sneak in a win. Now let's take a slight detour now and look at one of the big box expansions, the one that introduced both co-op and solo play modes against a terrifying central enemy. Everyone's favourite cyborgs who take over planets and turn everyone into themselves. The Cybermen from Doctor Who. Yeah, sorry, I meant the Borg. The Borg are a little different as they aren't a player-controlled faction. Instead, they either experience exploration cards and expand from there, or they can start in the middle of the board and move outwards from there. They are not player controlled and move via an AI deck of cards. In combat, a Borg cube is incredibly tough. They have a 2-hit roll based on the number of Borg worlds in play, and roll 9 dice to hit. Each hit you do reduces their dice pool by 1, but if they roll 6s in combat, they regenerate a die. Plus, after every combat exchange, their shield rating goes up by 1, so you need to beat them badly and early, or they will outlast you. If you do defeat the Borg, you get to draw one of these called Borg techs though. The Borg will take over worlds and build pylons, and once they have 3 of those, they will build another cube. Left alone, the Borg are not only tough, they can swarm. The problem here though is that the Borg are almost impossible to beat in the early game, and if they move directly to your homeworld early, there's very little you can do to stop them. Their moving and timing rules are also a bit janky. As written, they just aren't a lot of fun and can totally dominate and unbalance a game, making it all about them, without really changing the victory conditions. If you do want to include the Borg in a game, I'd recommend trying them out solo first and seeing how that works for you. I'd also recommend checking out the unofficial fan rulebook variants on them. The Borg invasion is a cool idea, and fighting them off should be a good time, but I didn't find the way they were presented in the rulebook itself that fun. Still, I am working on my own homebrewed rules for them, adapted from the fan rulebook suggestions. Mostly because I love the idea of playing this game with a central threat in the board, and the Borg fill that role perfectly. And now from one of the most iconic Star Trek factions, to one of the most obscure ones, the Breen. Ah yes, the Breen. Oh, no, that's Princess Leia in disguise. This is the Breen, and you can see why I got the two mixed up. Now, unless you're a fan of Deep Space Nine, you'll be sitting there going, who the heck are the Breen? Well, they showed up late in that show as a new enemy for the Federation, Romulans and Klingons, most notably routing a combined fleet and destroying the main character's hero ship, the Defiant, which I believe is the only time in a Star Trek TV show that the hero ship has been blown up for real. Anyway, the Breen are antisocial isolationists who pretty much hate everyone, and this is stunningly well reflected in their mechanics. First, they can only trade with direct neighbours, when every other player can just send a ship to trade with someone, and they re-roll all failed hits in their own territory, making them a nightmare to invade. Their fleets are interesting, with the system patrol fleet being absolute juggernaut in defensive battles. 2 dice for each ship plus re-rolls means whoever attacks this fleet is in for a bad time. The science fleet is pretty normal, and the deep strike fleet is very odd. It allows you to bypass enemy fleets and bomb colonies directly. Yep, that means in order to stop them, you have to go into Breen territory. And oh, look at that, their starting tech blows up ships that enter your territory, and that narrative continues across their other technologies. Breen are super tough in their own space, and somewhat awful to have as a neighbour. Outside their own territory, they are nothing special, but it does make for a novel playstyle, where you have to push out every now and then to claim new ground, despite being outclassed in offensive operations. And you need to do that in order to get those new worlds, so you can then put your death grip on them. And while they seem like they would be ideal for a player who just wants to turtle and stay in their own space, you really get the best results from them by positioning yourself where players feel like they have to attack you to slow you down. And then you smile as their massive fleets break against your steely defenses. The Breen were introduced in the show mostly as an ally of the Dominion, and let's look at them next. A fascinating faction and the main villains of Deep Space Nine. They are a society ruled over by the Changelings, shapeshifters who distrust all other intelligent life, so seek to subjugate them. They're administered by the Weasley Vorta, and there's Jeffrey Combs again as Weyoun, and backed up by backgrown soldiers, the Jem'Hadar. The Dominion are the final faction we will look at. It comes in its own big box expansion, and that expansion has 3 distinct components to it. The first of which is the Dominion War mode of play. Here you can play 4, 6 or 8 player games in alliances. Each alliance works together to defeat the others, and it's very much a war game. Instead of just one starting world, you start with 5 worlds and a total of 12 nodes pre-built. This rockets the game immediately to the mid-game, and you can start building fleets and fighting almost immediately. Each alliance has strategy cards they can play to boost each other and create unusual effects, which is good, because there's very little exploration with all those pre-built worlds out there. And while you can and will get your home worlds overrun in this module, there are resistance cards that players who are eliminated can use to aid their allies and hope to rescue their world. This mode is a colossal table hog and changes the overall feel of the game a lot. I'd only recommend it for veteran players who want to play an actual space war game more than a traditional 4X experience. Oh, and some factions are just better at this mode. Looking at these alliances, I'd bet on Red to get the win easily, as the Dominion, Breed and Klingons all excel at the war-focused game, while the Ferengi and Vulcans in particular do not. The second module is the Gamma Quadrant, which you can use with or without the Dominion faction in play. Place this big tile with Bajor in the middle of the table, and you can move through the wormhole to the Idrin system and back and forth. You'll notice that Idrin has a green border, and that's because through the wormhole is an entirely different stack of exploration tiles for you to explore. Now, the Gamma Quadrant alone is an odd thing to include, but it works well with the Dominion in the game. Not that the Dominion must start in the Gamma Quadrant, but it's more fun if they do. Aside from having a unique start position, the Dominion brings some powerful and interesting tools to the table. But first, get used to playing without hegemony, because the Dominion doesn't care for that one bit. You can take over neutral worlds, but rivals must be invaded. Thankfully, the Dominion have the Jem'Hadar powered by Ketracel White, which allows them to spend command tokens to reroll. This is brutal, as it's for any kind of combat. This is backed up by very strong military-focused fleets. The Domination fleet is tough and can recover losses, the Battleship fleet is truly terrifying with boosted combat skills, and the Strike fleet can melt anyone they find. Dominion also uses changeling infiltrators and move them around the board, and many of their technologies make having an infiltrator on your world a nightmare. Other technologies either save you command tokens or use them for powerful effects. And it's this command token focused economy that is the key to good Dominion play. Control enough starbases, have plenty of ways to get more command tokens, and you can spend your way to victory. So the Dominion is very much an aggressive faction. You want to invade and you want to take starbases off your opponents to keep up your command token edge. But only after you secure the Gamma Quadrant as your own personal stomping ground and ensure no one encroaches on your domain. So aside from the Borg and the knowledge I'll very rarely get to play the Dominion War mode, I think there's a lot of neat stuff in the expansions for Star Trek Ascendancy. If I was looking at getting a 4th player expansion to the core game, Cardassians would be my first pick, as they fit well with the other 4 and aren't too odd. The Breed would mechanically be a good choice as well, but they're less well known. The Ferengi would be an ideal choice for a 5th faction, as they work best in bigger games. I'd save the Vulcans in particular until you're more experienced with the game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this faction review and strategy primer for Star Trek Ascendancy. And if you enjoyed this video, come support us on Patreon. Hit the notification button, like, share, and subscribe to the channel.